Welcome to America's Commercial Real Estate Show, your source for intel, forecasts, and strategies. Hello, I'm Michael Bull. Thanks for being with us today. This segment is brought to you by Bull Realty Asset and Occupancy Solutions, headquartered in Atlanta. Visit bullrealty.com. Well, today we're going to talk about something that is really pressing on a lot of people's mind today as tax reform and what might happen with the 1031 exchange. As all my listeners, viewers know, the 1031 exchange is used a lot in our business. It really generates the economy, business, transactions. It really is a big part of our economic environment around the U.S. and especially in commercial real estate. Well, we have tax reform and everything seems to be on the table. Today we're going to talk about the 1031 exchange. What's the likelihood of something changing or the 1031 exchange going away completely? It seems like everything is on the table. Well, we have some experts for us today on the show. Please welcome Evan Liddiard. He's Senior Policy Representative with the National Association of Realtors, and Dr. Robert Carroll, National Director, Quantitative Economics and Statistics with Ernst Young. They're joining me on Skype. Gentlemen, thanks for being with us.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Well, Evan, what is the real likelihood of 1031 going away or being altered significantly?
Well, that's a question nobody really knows the answer to, but we're very, very worried about it because tax reform is coming and there is a need to raise revenue to make the tax reform revenue neutral. And so they're on the lookout for trying to find what are considered by many to be unwarranted loopholes. And a lot of people don't understand what 1031 does or means, but it sounds like it might be a loophole. And since it could be considered to raise tens of billions of dollars to help pay for lowering tax cuts, it's on the table. And they're actually talking about it. It's not clear, but it's at risk and has been for some time. We're very worried.
Yeah, and it seems like in years past we've heard that 1031 might be on the table, but I guess it's a little different now with all this talk about tax reform, right?
Right. I think it's been fairly stable. People look at it, but in an environment like this where Republicans in Congress and the president have promised delivery of the tax reform and they want to do it this fall, it could be moving fairly quickly. And this is the most at risk we've seen it for some time.
Yeah. We do 1031s all the time and have done for years at my shop in Atlanta where we sell investment properties. It seems like, it seems like half of our deals involve 1031s. What are the statistics around the country? How many investment sales transactions are really involving 1031s?
Well, we don't know exactly. We have some information about that. It's a high percentage, and a lot of it's going to depend on the type of property. For example, office property, land, retail property, these tend to have 1031 exchanges a lot more often than other types of property. And some of it's geographical as well. We find a lot more on the West Coast, particularly California, and Oregon, Washington, and some of the western states than we do in some of the heartland or the East Coast by percentage. But of course, there are many of them everywhere.
Yeah, that's true. Well, Bob, what might the economic impact be if, say, 1031 just went away?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and that's one of the key questions if one wants to put together, design a pro-growth tax plan, and one's considering what should be in the plan and what would not be in the plan. You kind of want to evaluate provisions at the margin of whether they're going to contribute to economic growth or detract from economic growth. In 2015, Ernst Young released a study prepared on behalf of the Federation of Exchange Accommodators and a number of other, with the support of a number of other groups within Washington who were interested in the 1031 provision. And we found that when you if you were to repeal the 1031 provision and pair it with a revenue neutral reduction in the corporate tax rate, just enough of a corporate tax rate reduction that would use up the revenue that would be raised from repealing the 1031 provision. So you have that apples to apples comparison, that even when you did that, it would, the 1031 provision, its repeal would detract from economic growth. that it would reduce GDP by about $8 billion in the long run, and it would not be consistent with pro-growth tax policy. Repealing 1031, even when it's paired with a revenue-neutral rate reduction, actually increases the cost of capital, adversely impacts investment, and thus adversely impacts with less investment, less capital formation. Labor has less capital to work with, and as such, GDP in the long run would be somewhat lower than it would be otherwise.
Well, that's a pretty big hit on GDP, and it's not just the real estate world, right? It's a lot of businesses that work around us.
That's exactly right. The 1031 provision is actually very widely used. It's not just, I think 10, 15 years ago, people used to think of the 1031 provision as a real estate provision, but now I think it's much more widely used. It involves rental car fleets. It involves jet planes. It involves the cargo portion of tractor trailers. It involves railroad cars. There are a lot of things that are assets that are transferred using the 1031 provision.
Right, and I'm in commercial real estate, so like I said, we use it a lot, but it's also used in residential real estate and investment sales, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So how does the Trump factor impact all of this? You know, he's a commercial real estate background. Does that hurt? Does that help? Does it matter?
That's another very good question, and there's been a lot of speculation over the past months and years about that. Most people believe that the president probably has engaged in numerous 1031 transactions. I tend to think he has, or we don't have any proof of that. And therefore, some take comfort in the fact that, well, he's going to protect us. Well, I wouldn't take that much comfort in it. His main job is to get a tax reform proposal out and passed. And if it happens to pinch real estate, then so be it. One other factor of this that makes it more complicated is this same tax reform proposal that we think is coming offers something called immediate expensing, including of buildings. And many people think that if we have immediate expensing, meaning you don't depreciate it, but you write it off the very first year you buy it, that you don't need 1031 anymore, because you could just sell a piece of real estate and then roll over the gain in effect by buying another one the same year. And so a lot of people in Washington, especially on Capitol Hill, think that if you pass that, which will greatly stimulate the economy, then you've done away with the need of 1031. That's really not true, because land is not expensible under these proposals, but that it is a common perception that we're finding as we talk to staff and members on the Hill.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when you look at the tax law changes that we had on depreciation in, 1986. That didn't work out too well.
No, it certainly didn't. And real estate, particularly commercial real estate, is still very sensitive to that fact.
Yeah,
and I think those designing the tax plan are also sensitive to the potential for unintended consequences associated with a very large reform, as we had in '86 with the limitation of the passive activity limitations that were put in place, and other changes. I think after the ex post views, as those had fairly significant unintended consequences. So I think those who are designing the plan are receptive to discussions around what might be the unintended consequences as they put together a plan today.
Yeah, I think if the president and the Congress want to generate business, I think the 1031 is certainly a factor to consider. So, gentlemen, what is the timing on this? When might we know something?
Well, that's another difficult question to answer, but the president is putting a full court press on tax reform right now. In fact, he had folks over at the White House for dinner, and he's talking about members of Congress that are particularly key, trying to get them to be interested in moving this right away. And it looks like there's going to be perhaps agreement among all the Republicans within the next week or two as to what that plan might be, and we'll learn a lot more at that time. The goal is to try to get it finished before the end of this year, if possible. It's a very ambitious goal, but that is the goal.
Yeah, and that's pretty fast. So that might take effect then immediately or beginning next year, as far as if something did change with the 1031?
My guess is that tax rate reductions would probably be retroactive to the 1st of 2017 if they were to pass it this year, but tax increases may not be. The Congress generally is very leery of trying to make retroactive tax increases on people. So that one may be, hopefully, would be, if they did it, would be would be prospective only.
What are some parts of all this, gentlemen, that congressmen and maybe the president might not think about, that if we wanted to point out to them, hey, what about this, what about this, what about the impact of this if you abolish 1031 or significantly change it?
One of the ways the 1031 provision contributes to the economy is that it allows for the faster turnover of property for economic reasons rather than locking in assets for tax reasons. And if one were to repeal the 1031 provision without the complete and full expensing provision that it also included land, or if one kept kind of the contours of the current system largely intact, but lowered the rate, provided some accelerated depreciation, did some other things, and then repealed the 1031 provision to get the rate a little bit lower, I think one would have to worry about assets or capital getting locked into properties for a longer period of times. I think it would reduce the velocity. It would reduce the turnover of properties, and that's something I think would be a significant concern.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Less activity, less moving of properties, and in my experience of selling apartments and other properties, is that's when we get significant improvement in the housing stock and the office stock. That's when new investors come in and invest and turn properties around. And sometimes we see properties that people, companies haven't moved and they've owned a long time. They start deteriorating and they're just not putting enough money into them. So there's a lot of stimulus around the 1031, isn't there?
Yep.
Anything else that a congressman sitting in his office might not think about the 1031 that could jeopardize the economy or cause some hiccups?
Well, one thing we like to point out when we visit with members and staff on the Hill is just how widespread 1031 is, and this is a surprise to them. A lot of people might be surprised at this, some of your viewers as well, and that is that we did a recent survey of members of the National Association of Realtors, and it found that 63% of all of our members had been involved in a 1031 exchange, either for themselves or on behalf of a client over the past 4 years. Now, many of our members are not considered commercial in any way, but they might help folks with a rental home or rental properties, and it's just very widespread. And it's not just the big commercial players, but lots of mom and pop holders of investment property are involved in this, and very many of the constituents of members of Congress.
Yeah,
then as we indicated earlier, it also extends well beyond real estate. It's no longer just it's an important real estate provision, but it also extends well beyond real estate.
Yeah, I mean, you think about the less activity, you have all the people and all the companies and business that are affected, the lawyers, the accountants, the construction people, the surveyors, the engineers, the home improvement, the supplies, the construction. I mean, it could be pretty devastating, I think. And and we do commercial real estate every day, and I tell you that 1031s are a big part of the small investors who are moving properties and maybe separating from larger properties. The smaller ones are moving. Maybe they're getting up in age and want a different property type. There's certainly a lot of movement of properties around the 1031. Well, gentlemen, if someone wants to voice their opinion, either way, what's an easy way for them to do that?
Well, there are many ways to do it, but we think the most effective way, and particularly for those of your audience who are somewhat influential and big players in their communities, is to try to meet with the representative or their senator in person. If that's not possible, and make a phone call and talk to the staff person in charge of tax policy, and let them know just how important it is to their own state, their own district, of keeping 1031 in place, because it would make a difference in the economic growth and job creation of their district and state. And if they hear it from you, somebody who knows about what's going on in that district or state, it's going to mean something.
Absolutely. It's important to be engaged, and really now is the time to be engaged on these sorts of issues. You don't want to wait until the package is completely done. You want to engage as they're working on the package, and that's where they are right now.
Yeah, and there's some information on the Realtors website, right, where folks can make comments to send to folks.
We do have information about 1031 on there, lots of background information as well as some about the issue itself.
Yeah. Well, gentlemen, thanks for joining us today. We appreciate you being on the show.
Great to be
Absolutely.
with you.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, and keep up the good work. I certainly don't want 1031 to go away or be abolished. I think it'd be terrible for the economy. I think it'd be terrible for commercial real estate industry and everyone around it. We'll put some links below the audio or the video that you can check out and easily send some information to the politicians and let them know what you think. Now stay with us. We'll have more on the 1031 exchange, what might happen, what you can do. Stay with us. I'm Michael Bull. This is America's Commercial Real Estate Show.